everyone. My name is Rosie Goldsmith, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to Rock Talks, our new conversation series featuring literary rock stars from both Romania and Britain. The rocks in the title also have another significance, and I wonder if anyone's worked out yet what they mean. Our rock-shaped logo might just give you a clue. Tonight's live conversation with writers Paul Bailey and Marius Chivu, waiting patiently there in the wings, you can see them, is part of our literature festival Romania Rocks, brought to you by the Romanian Cultural Institute in London, the RCI, and the European Literature Network, ELNet. The literature of Romania certainly does rock, and over the 4 weeks of our festival, we'll be introducing you to some of Romania's greatest living writers in conversation with their equally brilliant British counterparts. All our events are free and easy to access. The authors' books are available to purchase through our dedicated booksellers. We've also just published the first ever magazine of Romanian prose and poetry in English, the Romanian Riveter. You'll find all the details about the magazine and the festival on the RCI and ELNet websites. And you can watch this and all our events again on our YouTube channel, thanks to London Video Stories. Tonight's show lasts about 1 hour. We'll answer your questions if you have any at the end, but please submit your questions before the end via the Facebook chat stream. Tonight, we are overjoyed to welcome our co-hosts, Romania's highly cherished cultural magazine Dilema Veche, who are, along with the RCI and ELNet websites, we're also all live streaming this event. So hello to all of you, hopefully thousands and millions everywhere, we do hope. And hello to Marius Chivu, who's worked at Dilema Veche as an editor and literary critic since 2005, I believe. Now, Marius is himself a writer of poetry, short stories, travel features, and he hosts a weekly literary radio show. Marius, you have the dream job. Now, I'm really pleased to meet you at last, because I've heard so much about you. Every time I go to Romania, they say, oh, you must meet Marius Chivu. So hi, how are you? And are you in Bucharest at the moment, or where are you?
I'm not in Bucharest. I'm in the countryside, somewhere in the middle of Romania. So I did spend all my pandemic year in this place, away from, away from danger, and just chilling, writing, reading, doing another like a sabbatical year or something like.
It's a good way to name the pandemic period a sabbatical year. I think that's probably a very good description for everyone. Now, Marius, is it true that the area you're in Romania is actually an area where you see these extraordinary rocks, these trovons, they're called? Is that correct? Yeah.
Yes, that's the one. I have one in my backyard.
You're very lucky, because when I was dreaming of the name of this festival, I was thinking, what could we call it? Because I know that Romania rocks anyway. And I thought, well, actually, there's a highly significant reason for it, that you have these growing, living, moving rocks. And I thought, well, that's what literature is basically too. So anyway, Marius, great to meet you. And I know that you'll be equally happy to meet Paul, your old friend, and forever friend Paul Bailey, who's sitting there in London, I think. Paul, is that correct?
Yes, I'm in my house in London.
Very nice to see you, Paul. Now, one of Marius's other great gifts is as a translator from English to Romanian, and he's translated Oscar Wilde and Lewis Carroll and, drumroll, Paul Bailey as well. Paul Bailey, who I hope everybody knows, is one of our most distinguished, and I know that word is overused, but distinguished novelists. And you're a biographer as well, Paul, broadcaster, critic, writer for TV and radio, and a true friend of Romania. Now, that's, for us this evening, probably the most exciting thing that we can talk about together. How did you two meet? How did you and Marius meet, Paul?
We met at a literary festival in a place called Neptune on the Black Sea. And it was a memorable trip for me, because I had heart failure in the last stages of the event and had to be rushed to hospital. And first of all, I went to a hospital in Neptune, and it was understaffed. It was out in the nowhere, really. They were wonderful. And then I was transferred to Constanza. And I'd already chatted with Marius and various Romanians there. And anyway, that was when we first met, but I had been there before, so I was no stranger to the place. But he was particularly kind to me, as were other people there. So we've been friends ever since, and as you say, he's translated 2 of my novels and all my poetry so far. Many of my poems have appeared in his magazine, Dilemma Vecchio.
Well, I'm so happy to bring you together again. And I mean, the astonishing thing is, and wonderful for all of us who love Romania, as you do, Paul, I think, as well, is that you have based 3 of your novels in Romania, or with Romanians, not necessarily in Romania. But I'm thinking, you know, first of all, it was Kitty and Virgil, your first in 1998. And then you had Uncle Rudolph, which was 2002. And then the most recent, which is The Prince's Boy, 2014, which Marius also translated.
Actually, Rosie, he has 5 of his novels translated in Romanian.
5 translated into Romanian, but are they all set in Romania, Marius?
Yeah. Oh, no. I mean, only the translation.
Oh, no, but that's great. Yeah. There's so many. Paul is very famous in Romania, I think.
I think.
Yeah, he wrote a small trilogy.
Yes, that's true.
About Romania.
That's true. So, tell us about translating Paul into Romanian. I mean, how did it start? How did the actual translate? I know the friendship, but did the translation come before the friendship or after the friendship? Had you already translated Paul Bailey before you met him?
No. After I met him, actually, when I met him 20 years ago, this September, I didn't know who he was.
Wow.
The funny thing is that he sent me his Romanian translation from London to Bucharest. So, so this is how I read his first novel, At the Jerusalem, actually, and Old Soldiers. 2 small novels put together in the same cover, between the same covers. And the translation of Uncle Rudolph came quite late. I can't remember actually how, but meanwhile, we become quite good friends. I visited him a couple of times in London. We exchanged a lot of stories. So yeah, it was a labor of love actually translating him, because I'm not a professional translator. I only translate what I can and what I like. It's not a job for me. It's something I do as a part as part of writing, actually, because during the translation, you as a writer learn a lot. So I wanted to learn more from Paul, so I translated his books.
Paul, let's talk about your connection with Romania and when that started, because I mean, I love the fact that your novels are so European and so cosmopolitan, and they touch so many different parts of my European soul, if you like. And I just wonder how it was Romania that you came to connect with so closely. Was it the history? Was it the people?
Well, I got a surprise invitation to Romania early in 1989. And the British Council explained to me that it was in fact from the Romanian Writers' Union. And at that time, a lot of very good Romanian writers held the Writers' Union in some school because they were collaborating with the status quo, which, as you know, meant Nicolae Ceausescu. And when I went there, I was astonished because I knew nothing about the place. And the curfews, the long queues in Bucharest for meat and bread, the fact that, you know, petrol was rationed, everything was rationed, and everywhere was bugged. And I met a very nice girl from the British Council, English girl, who spoke perfect Romanian. And she always checked, whenever we went out to dinner, she always checked if there was a bugging device under the table. And my hotel room was bugged, and I had no visitors there. So every noise I made was on record. Even if I farted, somebody would be listening to it. In the
I kept a recording of Paul Bailey's farts.
But it was a strange experience. And of course, every event that I was supposed to take part in was strangely cancelled at the last minute. So they paid me to go all the way to Iași, which is on the other side of the country. And I was greeted there by a very amiable man called Stefan, who said to me, "I'm afraid your event's been cancelled. Have you got any money on you?" And one thing that the Writers' Union had done was hand me stacks of leave. I was a sort of walking millionaire. I mean, I had thousands and thousands and thousands of things. So I remember him saying to me, let's go and have a meal and get some wine. So we went into this restaurant near the university, and he said, "Can you order 6 bottles of wine?" And I said, "That's a rather strange number to order." And he said, "Well, there's going to be a curfew at 7 o'clock. And of course, so they brought 6 bottles of wine, both colours, and put them on the table. And of course, Stefan's friends kept coming in and having a glass. So it was a very convivial evening. And I thought, I have come to a complete madhouse. And then, of course, I saw the dark side of it, and I was intrigued by the whole thing. I mean, it was one of the most unforgettable weeks of my life. It changed my whole attitude to writing. And you know, Marius has heard my stories about the place too many times, so I won't bore him with any more of them. But it really did make a huge impression on me. And of course, I understood some of the words were being said because, like you, I speak Italian. So when I heard words like gara, you know, and even appa for water was close enough to Italian. And so I could understand some of the stuff they were saying. And
you know what? It's that time, and I was in Romania for the BBC just at the end, just after Ceausescu had been executed, and it is unforgettable. And you know, Romania had, you know, made a very, very deep impression on me as well, and it's continued to this day, and it's resulted in this, and you know, creating a magazine of Romanian literature and having many Romanian friends. But I think it's also, you know, I was really moved by the trauma that our Romanian friends went through, and that probably was the most that was life-changing, I think, for me. And I wonder whether I mean, Marius was only 11 years old, I worked out, when the revolution happened. So I have no idea what you experienced in that time, or whether your parents and family, were they in Bucharest, Marius, or what happened to your family at that time?
Well, funny thing, I was writing this house. This was my grandparents' house. So it was in the winter, in the summer, in the winter holiday. So we watched the revolution on television, and we were kind of worried because one of my mother cousins was working back then as a bodyguard for Ceausescu. So we were worried for him, and luckily he was yeah. We saw him every time when Ceausescu was traveling the country, just right behind him, with the umbrella or something like that. And we were worried. We were worried for him, and luckily he was smart enough to, when Ceausescu took the helicopter and fled away from Bucharest, he went straight to the police and dropped his weapon, and he survived. I mean, he was like that. So but anyway, it was a strange experience for us to watch the revolution on television. So
what do you think, as writers and working in literature? I mean, Paul, this is, I suppose, back to what we were talking about just now, is that, to what extent the country obviously gripped you by the shoulders, and you've written about the history of Romania. You've also written about the impact of being exiled from Romania in Kitty and Virgil. Of course, Virgil was a refugee, and I mean, you've tackled the Romanian situation, if you like, the country, the culture, in so many different ways. What is it that really grabbed you about the country, the culture, the language, to write so extensively about it?
Well, surrealism was born there for a start.
Dada and surrealism.
And you can understand why. Even now you can understand why. And when I went there, I'd always thought that the plays of Eugen Ionescu were, fantasies, were, very funny plays, but I didn't quite see the realistic side of them. And so I went to Romania thinking that Ionescu was a fantasist, an absurdist, and came away with the belief, which I still maintain, that he's an actual realist, because the life there was so crazy at the time. It was crazy. And people are made crazy by politics, by power. And, the history of Romania is one of constant invasion. And it's reflected in the language, with words from Greek and Turkish and Italian. Anyway, it's a Latin language because the Romans were there for centuries. But and I suppose it's that sense of everyday absurdity, which I've always loved in literature. I love it in Dickens. I love it in Kafka. And there it was. The other thing that impressed me, and it still impresses me, that on the way to Iași, there was an old driver there. It was great fun. He taught me all the swear words in Romanian. And at one point, we stopped at the the cemetery that contained the grave of Mihail Eminescu, the most famous Romanian poet. And he took me there and he stood by my side, and I looked round and he was crying. And I thought, I can't imagine. Well, I suppose I could imagine some very sensitive soul going to, say, see the cemetery in Rome where Keats and Shelley are buried, and being a bit tearful. But this was a man who you don't associate with literature. You only associate people who cry at things like that with fellow poets or professors or something. And I was very, very touched by that. And it's an impression that stayed with me. And I think in those countries in Central and Eastern Europe, poets were revered in a way, living poets, I mean, were taken more seriously than they are in so-called liberated countries where poets are appreciated by a coterie, by a small number of readers. But even the most opaque and surreal poems were speaking to people who didn't normally read poetry. And I found that amazing.
Beautiful, Paul. I mean, Marius, do you recognize that description of you as Romanian writers? I mean, you're a poet and a short story writer as well as and a biographer yourself. And I mean, do you see that as a description of yourself? Do you feel moved to tears when you see your great national poet or statues of your great national poet?
Well, not quite, but that's because the school, you know, the education program, the curricula, because they drove us crazy with the national poets, you know, and
Yes.
and we well, while I was in school, and that this happened to me, but also with younger generation. You get out of school with the impression that there are no living poets, because all they teach you is the dead ones. So you need time, and you need to really grow up and to be deep into literature to finally read the poetry of national poet, or the literature of the big Romanian authors or something like that. It's not, you have to put away all the prejudices, all the things that the teachers taught you, and it's a difficult process, you know, to finally read the way it used to read, you know, the good national literature.
In your own writing, Marius, you know, when did you start writing? And I know that your writing life constitutes many different parts as a critic and as an anthologist as well. You've both of you, Paul and Marius, you've actually worked very hard on creating anthologies of short stories, or you know, Paul, I think it was an Oxford anthology you created, and so on, and London Life, and you've been very active in lots of different areas of writing. And I wonder, Marius, particularly, what, you know, when you started and how it started, and whether the journalism is equal to you as your own writing. I mean, how do you balance it all?
Well, you know, probably the most loved Romanian author, he was a playwright, Caragiale, once said that it's hard for a Romanian who knows how to read not to write. So, yeah, I guess everybody in high school years is reading and start writing poetry, love poetry. Of course, this happened to me as well. So after a while, I discovered short stories, and I wanted to write short stories, but it happened that my first book was a poetry one. It's because I wrote it as a personal diary, but it turned out it was a poetry book. So it meant a great deal for me, because it was built around a family drama. So I wanted to be the poetry book to be the first one. So
that's your poetry anthology. That was your first published book. But then
yeah,
you've gone on to write short stories as well.
Right, right, and
Yeah.
then a couple of travel books, but I like to shift between genres. So I'm quite happy that Paul right now he's writing poetry, and it seems that he cannot stopping himself writing poetry. He published a book last year, and I guess he has material for another one.
Paul, have you got any of your poetry with you?
Yes, I have.
Maybe we can maybe at the end as a special treat we could have a poetry reading from you. That would be lovely, and maybe from Marius too. That would be super as well. So Marius, what about I mean, Paul was talking just now mainly about older Romanian writers of Eminescu and Jalunam, I think, and I don't know whether you mentioned Ciuran, but there are a number of writers who I know that you revere, the older Romanian writers. For you, Marius, is it the same, or are you reading mostly contemporary Romanian writing now? And what is going on in modern Romanian writing?
Well, I know the Romanian authors Paul loves. I love them too. I mean, probably Max Blecher and Mihail Sebastian, both published in English at Penguin, I guess. They both
various publishers, yes.
Right.
Yes.
And both of them are great, and I love them too. So, but because a couple of years I teach Romanian modern literature, I have to get into the old literature, modern literature, interwar period literature. But because of my because I work as a book reviewer, I mostly read the contemporary authors. So it's quite a balance because the good literature has been written, in the history. Even though Romanian literature has a very small history, only 100 years old, you can find pieces of gold everywhere you look.
Do you think that the literature that's been written, after 1989, after the Romanian Revolution, is great literature?
Well, I guess the most important thing that happened after the revolution is that there was no more censorship. So the Romanian literature quite changed, especially the novels. Because during the censorship, poetry was doing quite well. We really have in communism great poets who publish great books, poetry books, because censorship helps the language. Paradoxically, censorship helps the language, but the novelists, they struggle with the censorship, and their novels are quite vulnerable in today for a younger readership who don't know the context, who don't know the language with double meaning that they are building, that they were building before the revolution.
So what I mean, is it mostly? I mean, there was a lot of. I recall myself. There was a lot of non-fiction published after the revolution, and because people were trying to explain, what was going on. There were a lot of essays. There was a lot of journalism, a lot of feature writing. Has there been a more creative explosion, do you think, of poetry and fiction, even if they're not long novels? I mean, I've read a lot, and it's been absolutely incredible, wonderful. I've read a lot of poetry. We've got a lot of poetry in our magazine, actually, too.
It was quite an explosion during the 90s, because we have to get back the classics that they were censored. We published the forbidden Romanian authors in exile. Cioran, Eugene Ionesco, and the others. So we had a lot of memoirs because everybody wanted to publish the memoirs of and of course there was an explosion of poetry and prose because all of a sudden everybody could publish.
Yes. Yeah.
So back then, I mean, the 90s were great. And people were still reading literature. We only have one TV channel, so literature was high in people's lives. So, but that changed a lot. I mean, it's like the golden age for publishing, for Romanian publishing, the 90s.
But then what happened? I mean, that was all in Romanian. Of course, we have had so little in English, haven't we, Paul? From that, we're beginning to get more translations, more published in English, but not enough to know, to have a real feel for contemporary Romanian writing. Have you been reading contemporary writers, Paul?
Not many, I have to confess. I've read one or two. But I know that there's a large number. I mean, Marius has given me their names sometimes, and of course there's nothing available here. And they're not published by what one might call the major houses. And the French are much better at this than we are, because they tend to translate most Romanian books. And there's always been this kind of cultural link with the other part of Europe, as it were, that we haven't maintained. I mean, we published quite a few Polish poets here and a few Polish novelists. So I'm more acquainted, in fact, with Polish poetry in translation, of course, than I am with contemporary Romanian poetry or prose.
Well, I mean, there are several independent publishers, if you like, smaller houses who are publishing Romanian literature in English. But you're right. I think that there is. It's the British problem, if you like. It's our Anglo-centric problem. But Paul, what I was really, I suppose, touched by was your knowledge of Romanian literature. And you said yourself it was primarily the older writers, but you're obviously deeply connected to them. And I'm thinking of The Prince's Boy, your third novel, which was set in Romania, which is the most recent one, 2014, which Marius has actually translated. And I've only just read that, and I think it's an absolutely beautiful, beguiling, wonderful, moving novel. And it's about the 1920s and 30s in Bucharest and Paris. It's a completely different era. Well, you obviously love that period.
Well, it's been documented quite a lot, that period. And the 1930s in Romania is a period I'm fascinated by, particularly after reading the diary of Mihail Sebastian, which is, I think, a wonderful book. And it's wonderful in many ways because it's so personal. It doesn't take a kind of long view of history. It's about a man who is eventually almost frightened to go out into the street. And he sees his best friends, who are the notable Romanian intellectuals of that period, most notably Emil Cioran, who regretted his ways and became a great writer in French, and Mircea Eliade, who never apologized for his pretty ghastly opinions. I mean, he was a world expert on religion and knew everything about comparative religion. But he fell head over heels with the Nazis. And so that period fascinates me, and it has particular relevance today. because what was going on then is now going on, particularly in Hungary, and I regret to say Poland to a certain extent. And even here, I mean, here we pretend that we don't take our politics that seriously, but I'm sorry to get political, but I do feel Brexit is the most terrible thing that's happened in my lifetime since the Second World War. I think, you know, we had come to terms with the fact that we were part of Europe, that our history is greatly dependent, particularly our thinking history, our literary history, is dependent on what was happening in Europe. You know, when you think that Shakespeare and Chaucer were inspired by Italian texts, by medieval French and Italian literature. And what have we come to? This sort of awful, grotesque nationalism, which is what I saw when I went to Romania, except they were powerless under this regime, which was a kind of distorted Marxism. It was a kind of dreadful capitalist interpretation, but the capitalism was only shared amongst a few privileged people. It didn't apply to the whole society. And of course, the tragic thing about Romania after Ceausescu's death was that they were plunged into a kind of Thatcherite economy, having lived under, you know, severe Soviet restrictions. And before that, they were at the hands of the Nazis, you know. So Romania's history in the last century has been pretty tragic. And Sebastian's journal reflects that wonderfully. And of course, the fact that he'd never thought about being Jewish. He just thought he was a human being. His family happened to be Jewish. He had no serious religious convictions. And suddenly he was reminded of the fact that he was a Jew. And I think this is reflected all over the world at the moment. And of course, we've got Ubu Wa sitting in the White House. You know, he's the kind of fool. I keep thinking of UNESCO's play Rhinoceros. You know, when you see the crowds cheering the orange horror on, you think, God, where have their brains gone? And
it's interesting, isn't it, how we're bringing up the absurd again. UNESCO is so relevant today. I mean, I studied UNESCO at
the absurdity is worldwide now. And what upsets me is I was born in 1937 in a world that nationalism was taking a grip on, a grip that seemed, you know, that it was going to stay forever, that no one could ever escape that. And history is now very much repeating itself.
Marius, can I bring Marius in here to hear? I mean, Paul is talking about your country, our country. How do you feel in any way insulted by that, by this interpretation, or do you feel Paul is actually interpreting your country, our countries correctly?
No, he's quite right. Fortunately, Romania right now is doing quite well comparing to Hungary or Poland or USA. After 2 years of protesting in the streets, we exchanged in a good way the political situation. So we are actually in a good point right now. If I mean, we are dealing right now like the rest of the world with the pandemic, but in Romania, the nationalists the nationalists are not that powerful, even though we see the Russian propaganda working through the Orthodox Church, the churches, the Russian Church and the Romanian Orthodox Church. They are church sisters. So, but I'm not worried right now. I don't see it as a bad as a dangerous period comparing to you with Brexit and with Trump and with other places where the situation went crazy.
Let's bring it back to talking about how this impacts on literature, I suppose, because I'm wondering, are Romanian writers today, are the writers you're writing about and broadcasting about on your programs, are they looking at their past, looking at that period under Ceausescu and trying to make sense of it still, or are they moving on and writing entertainment, or are people not reading books at all? I mean, tell me what you think is happening, is how Romanians are dealing with their past now.
My generation are still writing about communism because we grew up then, and we are both nostalgic, and we got the sense of absurdity. But we were kids, so the drama was on our parents' shoulders. We were somehow we didn't see the whole image, but right now we understand what we were living then. And I see in the last years female authors, Romanian authors, interested in things like the abortion. When Ceausescu, during the Ceausescu, it was a law against abortion. So there were 10,000 women who died trying different solutions for making abortion back home, or
they were what we called, in fact, one of the BBC programs I made when I went to Romania, because I went several times for the BBC, was about the tabletop abortions, as they were called. I mean, right. It was the most horrendous, one of the most awful stories I've ever had to cover.
And I see female authors interested in that, looking back from this point of view. But other way, I don't know. I guess we are not there. Probably in the 2000 year, 2000, 2004 or something like that. It was a period when my generation was writing more about communism, but not anymore. We are quite focused on what's happening right now. We were on the streets during the protests. We were on Facebook trying to maintain the enthusiasm in protesting for such a long time and making a stand. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and Marius, what about your writing? I mean, I've read one of your short stories in English, which is an absolutely fantastic short story. I mean, I've got it here. It's from your from the anthology End of Season. It's really wonderful. It's called Through the Wide Open Doors, and it's translated by Alistair Ian Blythe. It's accessible. If anybody wants to read it, it's actually online, so it's easy to get hold of. I don't know whether Paul has actually read it, but it's wonderful. And I wonder, Paul's read it as well. I wonder who your great sort of short story heroes are.
Well, there are too many, and of course, starting with Chekhov. But
Chekhov, yeah, of course.
Let me tell you, I know a lot of great short story writers because Paul recommended them to me. And probably the most surprising one was Peter Taylor. I don't know if you
I've never heard of him. I feel embarrassed. Paul, who is Peter Taylor?
He was from the deep south of America. He died not too long ago.
Oh.
Most of his stories are set in Tennessee in the 1930s and 40s, and even earlier. He came from quite a patrician family, Taylor. He was the best friend of the poet Robert Lowell. They went to school together. And Taylor, who was a very courteous man, I met him in America in the 70s. He never quite achieved the fame that he should have done. He was published here by very reputable publishers, but he never really took off in the way that the more Gothic writers took off. You know, people like Carson McCullers or even Flannery O'Connor. He didn't deal in a kind of mad deep south that we're familiar with. His was the kind of posh deep south, you know, where they all had family history and they all lived in antebellum houses. But they're scathingly witty and they're beautifully constructed.
Oh, well, this is absolutely, you know, going to be on my list. Thank you for that too. And thank you, Marius, for introducing me to an American short story writer.
Thanks to Paul, I discovered Alice Smith.
Alice Smith, yeah, absolutely.
And Elizabeth Taylor.
Yeah.
The writer, not the actress. So
both are very, very highly recommended, of course. Both the actors and
Annie Smith is my dearest friend, along with Marius. So, we're on the same wavelength. I mean, I think she's trying to capture something about the way we live now, which is very adventurous, I think.
Paul, are you, I mean, in the same way that you've just spoken about Alice Smith, who has, I mean, to give it that rather horrendous label, she's actually written some Brexit literature, I mean, commenting on the time we live now. If she's translated into Romanian, is she, Marius? Alice
yes,
Smith?
yes, yeah. He's the season book.
The four seasons, yes.
We have 3 out of 4 already.
Well, we've only just had number 4, so you're obviously being very quick. Are you translating them?
No.
But I mean, what are you both doing now to reflect the period that we're going through? Paul's already spoken scathingly about Brexit, and you know, obviously we're going through very difficult times, upheavals because of the pandemic. Are you both addressing that in your writing, in your work at all? Marius, what about you? Are you?
I am not. I don't think every writer should do it. It depends. I write mostly. I don't know. I don't try to connect automatically with the things that are living right now. I need time to understand them. I don't want to jump in to rush in, and I don't feel the need, and I don't think readers are quite keen to read something like that. And I guess Paul is on the same page with me. He's been writing poetry all this year. I've been writing poetry this summer, so nothing to do with what's happening.
So, Paul, is that for you a form of escapism from what's going on now, your poetry, or is it some reflection?
Not at all. I've been wanting to write poetry all my life, and I did have some published in the TLS about 25, 30 years ago. A whole sequence of them, I couldn't stop writing them. And then I've been quite ill, so I've had a lot of time to reflect on what I'm actually writing about and what I want to write. So I find now that I'm finding it virtually unstoppable to write poetry. I just need it. But it's not therapeutic. I'm trying to discover things. And I've always valued economy in writing. And I find that, you know, if one can say something on the page that has resonance and keeps you thinking and moves you or makes you laugh or something, all those feelings, it's good. And of course, I'm delving into things of my past that I thought I'd forgotten. You know, one of the it's both a blessing and a curse of age is that remember things that have been buried for 40, 50, 60 years. And suddenly they come flashing back at you. And I find that I have to put them down. I have to capture them again. And I'm having relationships now with my parents. I've been dead. My father's been dead for most of my life. Discovering him, because he died when I was 11 and I'm now 83, so it's a long, long time ago. And I'm sort of putting him together in poems. And they're not all entirely personal, they're reflections, but they're certainly not political. I've never written that kind of stuff. Like Marius, I can't get engaged on that level because I have a fear that it will turn out to be journalistic. And I've always separated my journalism from my serious, in quotes, writing. I take journalism seriously, but it's not the same as creating a novel, for example, where you have to be distant and disinterested. The literature I favor is mostly disinterested, even when you're writing about yourself. You're looking at yourself from a different perspective. And I've come back to, I was very blessed when I was at school by a teacher who made me learn poems every week. And he tested me. And it's been a great thing to get through life with masses of poetry inside your head.
And it's all coming out. It's all spilling out. Are you writing every day? Are you?
Well, I'm trying to now. And in fact, I've got the compulsion now that I haven't had for years. I feel it's usually late at night, and I've watched some idiot stuff on the television, and I've been thinking about life, and I've started to write versions of or translate some Italian poetry of the 13th century, for God's sake.
Oh.
And I found one the other day that is a wonderful description of Donald Trump. So I'm going to change...
From the 13th century?
Yes, I'm going to change the name Cecco into Donaldo and see if it works.
It makes it sound far too nice, Donaldo.
No, it's quite a funny poem. It's a poem about wanting to rule the world. It's about a frustrated boy from Siena who wants to screw around and take possession of everything. So this is for me.
I think Marius is going to have a lot of translation on his hands if you're being this productive at the moment. But Marius, are you writing as much poetry then at the moment? Are you writing short stories? Or are you writing poetry? What are you really sort of immersing yourself in at the moment?
Well, writing poetry this summer was quite a surprise to me because I never thought I'm going to write poetry again. I always
you're very young. You're so young. You could never say never.
I'm not a poet. It happened to me to write a poetry book, but I don't feel myself, and I don't see myself. I don't see myself as a poet. But it was a strange year, so it's not quite a surprise that.
Have you got more time on your hands, or are you finding that work is very busy as well?
Well, no, yeah, I was quite happy here in the country house. My parents are living quite near, so probably the effect of nature, staying outside for such a long time, watching the seasons changing, watching the light of the day changing. So hearing the birds singing and all that stuff put me in a mood that as Paul said earlier, I looked back and deep inside me, and I discovered something that it needed to be on a page and in a form of something that looks like poetry.
And it's interesting that it's poetry that is actually able to be the format for the self that you are discovering, both of you. The way you're describing it at the moment, it's poetry. That's what you're turning to.
And probably reading Paul's poems gave me a push, some sort of inspiration. I don't know, because he's sending me every week a new poem. Is like a service I'm I'm connected with, and every week I discover a new poem in my email, and I read it. And
oh, you lucky man, Marius. Paul, have you got something you could read us to? Do
you want, which poem do you want me to read, Marius? Is there one that you like?
Well, it's a poem about the Romanian nurse. It's on the page 44 in your book.
And what's the name of the book, Marius?
It's Inheritance, his poetry book, right. published last year.
By who's it published by?
By CB Editions.
CB Editions.
Fantastic. Just so that we can all look for it. We have a wonderful bookseller as well, selling all the books you're talking about. So let's make sure that we put that one on the list. So Paul, have you got that poem?
Yeah.
I mean, we talk about him reading this poem because it has the Romanian character in it. So
he knows the poem that we had in mind. There's a poem called Cu voi, With You, by George Bacovia. And it goes, Mai bine singura te și uitat, pierdut. Now I've forgotten it. Pierdut.
Marius, do you know it? Do you know it?
No, he knows more Romanian poetry by heart than me.
Pierdut, te se, no, nepăsător in țara asta plină de umor, mai bine singurătate și uitat. O genii întristate, care mor, un cerc baba și fără sentiment. Prin asta ești celebră în Orient, în țară tristă, plină de umor. And I said to this girl, the nurse in the hospital, do you know this poem, Cu voi? And she started saying it. As she said it, I remembered the lines. So this is the poem I wrote about that. It's called Lyrical. Nadia, the nurse from Brasov, is cleaning my arse with hygienic wipes. We're in Ward 7 west of a London hospital on an overcast summer afternoon, and I'm delighting in her company. We're both in love with the melancholy poetry of George Bacovia, which we're reading to each other as she dabs away down there. We have a single poem in mind. It's called With You, and the you is probably the beset Romanian people he is addressing with such beauty. He tells them it is good to be lonely and forgotten and lost in this unfeeling place, this country full of humour. It's in the last of his 8 undying lines that he adds the adjective sad. Oh, sad country full of humour. he found himself writing at the dawn of a decade that held few promises of hope. There would be terror to come. Nadia puts on a new pair of rubber gloves now that her task's completed. She eases me into the protective underwear I'll need in emergency. And then she shows me some photos of her family back home. Her mother has osteoporosis, she sighs. She takes my hand and presses it. I offer her my thanks. She has to go. Another patient's waiting. So I just thought it was an incredible experience, which I had put down. A nurse wiping my arse, and we were reciting poetry together. And she knew it by heart, but she told me that she'd learned it in school.
And then you knew it by heart.
He's now on the curriculum, but he was banned during Ceausescu's time. He's been restored now because he was apolitical, even though he worked in a local council. And he drank a lot. He was very melancholy, but he's kind of
sounds like a character in one of your novels, Paul. Oh, Marius,
I'm sorry I forgot the lines.
Oh no, I'm so impressed, and you're Romanian as well too. I mean, you've both learned each other's languages, because I mean, when did you learn English, Marius, too?
Well, I had to learn it all by myself because during school before the revolution, we were forced to learn Russian, and after that, it happened that I didn't have the chance to go to a school where to learn English. So I learned it all by myself, listening pop songs and then reading magazines and short stories and stuff like that. I mean, I translate much better than I speak.
Well, translating Paul Bailey and Lewis Carroll and Oscar Wilde. I mean, that's a great, if you like, a great education in itself.
Well, yes, but about Lewis Carroll, I imagine, I remember when I began translating some of his letters, not literary work, and I remember emailing to Paul saying, I'm working right now on a Lewis Carroll translation, and he said, "Are you aware that he's one of the most difficult English writers ever?" And I said, "Yes, but I'm only translating his letters."
Well, there's always. I mean, is Alice in Wonderland? Is that translated into Romanian?
Oh yes. I mean, we have many translations, because the advantage
one of my favorite books.
The advantage of being a small culture is that you have to translate a lot.
Well, yes. Now, Marius, do you have one of your poems or a piece of writing you'd like to read?
No, I rather not.
Absolutely your choice.
But I'm going to tell you a short piece of memory of me and Paul, because the funny thing, I mean, not the funny, but somehow the strange thing is that when I really connected with Paul in 20 years ago, it was actually on a hospital bed. He had that heart failure, and he was standing there with needles in his arms and completely white. And he promised me a couple of days earlier to tell me by heart one of Bacovia's poems. And he didn't have the chance. So here we are in the hospital, with him in the bed, lying in the bed, and reciting one of Bacovia's poems. And that was a moment I don't think I will ever forget. And after that, he just write me his email address, and that's how we started writing letters, sending books, and seeing each other again after a couple of years. And yeah, so I can say I met Paul Bailey on a hospital bed.
and on a Zoom. I mean, I must say, I am so moved to have heard your stories and to have heard you both talk about your friendship and how you met, but how you translate each other, how you both write poetry, how you love each other's. Well, Paul particularly loves Romania, obviously, and the Romanian writers and history. But it's just been an incredible experience to sit here and listen to you both. And we have to end it now, unfortunately, because you know, we could sit here for hours, I'm sure, talking about Romania and Britain and literature and translation, and to be continued, I hope, one day. But it's just been wonderful to listen to you both. So thank you very, very much, Marius Chivu and Paul Bailey. And thank you to the Romanian Cultural Institute and to European Literature Network, to London Video Stories, and everybody working on this festival. Is just the most wonderful, remarkable things are coming out of these meetings that we're having. It's online, but it's real. They're real. Thank you both so much.
Thank you, Rosie.
It's just been lovely. Mulțumesc. Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.